Nervous System, Chapter 9. This is one of the more difficult units, so take really good notes. We've talked about homeostasis before, and two systems work very strongly together to maintain homeostasis, and that is the nervous system and the endocrine system. The nervous system is get it done now, no waiting around about it. But if you ran full-time on your nervous system, system would wear out because it's just too much, too electrically charged. The endocrine system, on the other side, it does maintain it. And what it does is it does the maintenance work. It keeps the balance there. If you lived on the nervous system, you would be in fight or flight all the time. So if you've ever been scared by a family member, or if you've ever seen a snake and you don't like them, or seen a spider and you don't like them, you will have that fight or flight. So if you ran on that full time, your body would not be able to handle it. But you need it there for when you need to get something done, you need to get it done now. The endocrine system works on a chemical system. Both work very close together to maintain homeostasis. Both send signals to the body structures, increasing or decreasing their activity as needed. First objective. List the organs and divisions of the nervous system and describe the generalized function of the system as a whole. There are two principal divisions that make up the nervous system. It is the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system. Anything that is not the brain or the spinal cord is the peripheral nervous system. The subdivisions of the peripheral nervous system is the autonomic nervous system, and the autonomic nervous system is the one that is automatic. Right? So the automatic nervous system, or autonomic, okay, they're both together, responds as it receives the stimulus. There's two aspects of the autonomic nervous system. One is the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. Both will be discussed further as we come along to each of them. Their purpose is to maintain balance in the body. Know that the autonomic nervous system is not the only system for the peripheral nervous system, but it is the primary one. This is a schematic of the nervous system. The central nervous system between the brain and the spinal cord has two arrows, so there's interchange both ways. You'll see that also with the cranial nerves and the spinal nerves. What happens with the sensory nerves is the sensory nerves send the information in, and then it goes out to the autonomic or somatic nervous system. So when I said there was a more on the peripheral nervous system, there's the somatic, okay? And see the sensory nerves? That's the other system. Second objective, identify the major types of cells in the nervous system and discuss the functions of each. The cells within the nervous system can be grouped in two categories. The neurons, which are the electrical wires. Okay. If you've ever seen wiring in the house, it's that copper wire that goes down through the center of the plastic. Then there's glia cells. Now, glia cells is more like the wrapping of that wire. It's the protective, and it's glue, as the Greek word calls it. It's glue that holds things together. We'll start with neurons. Well, the neuron, their function is to conduct electrical impulse from one area to another. So it's our wiring. The neurons are classified as specific types, and they're grouped together according to function. And so the major ones are sensory neurons, motor neurons, and interferons. And the sensory neurons, the axon of the afferent neuron could synapse with an interneuron, conducting impulses to the spine and the brain. Sensory neurons bring information to the brain by means of receptors. Motor or efferent neurons conduct impulses away from the brain and spinal cord to the muscles and glands. The primary function of the motor neuron is to cause movement or secretion. Efferent neurons are those which carry impulses to the muscles and the glands. I wonder why I repeated that. They are part of the somatic nervous system, which provides voluntary action of the skeletal muscle tissue. Interneurons, on the other hand, they connect. So an interneuron conducts impulses from sensory neurons to motor neurons. They're sometimes called central or connecting neurons. All interneurons lie entirely within the gray matter of the brain or the spinal cord, and are also known as central or connecting neurons. Neurons. What do they look like? What's their structure? Well, their body structure, they've got a body, the central body, and it looks sort of like what you'd expect to see with an octopus, if you've ever seen one of those. And it's got dendrites and it's got axons. Well, dendrites are the branches that conduct impulses to that cell body, that neuron body. And the end of the nerve cells are receiving all the messages. Then there's the axon. Well, what does the axon do? Well, it's an elongated projectile that conducts impulses away from the cell body. And it transmits impulses, always remember, away from the cell body. What's myelin? Myelin is a segmented wrapping of the axon. Neurons are electrically charged, and so the myelin helps to protect that. This is a diagram of what a neuron, typical, underline typical neuron looks like. It shows the dendrites, the cell body, and the axon. The segment on the right-hand side of that is what you see when you see Schwann cells, and they're filled with myelin, and it's a concentric layers of that around the axon. See how the axon's in the middle? Okay, the glia. The glia is a neuroglia, and it's a Greek word which means glue. It supports the cells, bringing the cells of the nervous tissue together structurally and functionally. It varies in size. An important reason for discussing the glia is that one of the most common types of brain cancer is a glioma, which develops from the glia. There are three main types of glia. There's the astrocytes, the microglia, the oligodendrocytes, and we will talk about each one individually on the next few slides. Astrocytes. Astrocytes are star-shaped cells that anchor small blood vessels to the neurons. Astrocytes form a two-layer structure called the blood-brain barrier. So whenever we talk about the blood-brain barrier, we're talking about astrocytes. Microglia. So that would make you think small, right? Micro is small. Smaller than astrocytes. They usually remain stationary. In the case of degeneration or inflammation of brain tissue, it enlarges and moves and surrounds the microbes and draws the microbe into its cytoplasm and digests the microbe. So this is, the microglia is the waste management. And if this microglia doesn't do its job, it creates that gliomas, the tumor in the brain. Oligodendrocytes hold the nerve fibers together. They form the myelin sheath on the axons in the central nervous system, which is your brain and your spinal cord. There is no neurolemma in the central nervous system. So the oligodendrocytes handle the job. Okay, in review, osteocytes are extensions attached to the blood vessels in the brain and form the two-layered structure called the blood-brain barrier. Microglia is within the central nervous system. Microglia usually remain stationary, but inflamed, it becomes enlarged and move about and act as microbe-eating scavengers. And the oligodendrite and its extensions that form the myelin sheath around the axon of the central nervous system. Oligodendrocytes help hold the nerve fibers together and produce a fatty myelin sheath that envelops nerve fibers located in the brain and the spinal cord. So now we're going to talk about the glia in the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so this is glia, but it's working in the periphery. So you're not going to find this in the brain and the spinal column. You're only going to find it in periphery nerves. So you'll have what are called swan cells. They form a myelin sheath around the axons of the peripheral nervous system. They're a white fatty substance that wraps around some axons. They electrically insulate the neurons. You will also find nodes of Revere and there are gaps between the adjunct Schwann cells. You'll also find neurolema wrapped around the outer layer of the Schwann cells, and it's an essential part in the regeneration of cut or injured axons not located in the axons of the brain and the spinal column. Okay, so you need to remember that. If you can answer these questions without looking in the book and looking at your notes, then you're way on your way to getting a good grade on this test. These are spaced in your book, so utilize them when you're studying, and they're in every chapter. Let's talk about this wonderful blood-brain barrier. The blood-brain barrier separates the tissue in the blood vessels from the nerve cells themselves. So the blood-brain barrier is formed by the walls of the vessels and the astrocytes. And it's a two-layer formation of astrocytes. It separates blood and nerves. It's real important to know about because if we have medicines that we want to go into that brain, we need to have it that it can cross that blood-brain barrier, because there's times that you want chemicals in that brain to help fix that brain. So you don't have to worry about some medicines in there. It's usually what you're worrying about is, can I get medicines into the brain through the blood-brain barrier? It's really a good safety mechanism to prevent our brain from being damaged. Okay, nerves and tracts. Nerves are a bundle of peripheral axons. They're grouped together and the fibers are bundled together, and like you would see in a cable, they're usually white because of the myelin sheath that's over them. And a tract is a bundle of the central neurons. So look at the difference. The nerves are peripheral axons, and the tracts are central axons. Let's talk about white matter and gray matter. White matter is the tissue that's composed primarily of myelinated axons. And remember that myelinated axons are called nerves in the periphery, called tracts in the brain. They often look white. They are almost all peripheral nerves. You will see this white matter. You don't see the gray matter. The gray matter is primarily located in the cell bodies and the unmyelinated fibers, and that's what you find the majority of the time in the brain. So the brain is going to be more gray matter than white matter. The peririum is the smooth, transparent, tubular membrane, which may be easily separated from the fibers it encloses. So how it's different from the enerium is that the enerium is a thicker fiber. The epineurum is the outer layer of dense, irregular connective tissue surrounding the peripheral nerve. So this is usually in the peripheral nervous system. So what we're looking at here is the breakdown of the protective sheaths on a nerve in the peripheral nervous system. Here's a picture of what we were talking about previously. So take a look at what each one covers. So you're going to find that each area, they're all coverings, but they are covering different parts of this nerve of the axon. Number 3, identify the anatomical components of a reflex arch and explain its function. We're going to talk about different ways that the nerve signals are carried. So you have the reflex arch, the nerve impulse, and the synapses. And we're going to go into more in depth on the next few slides. Okay, reflex arch. First thing before we start, we need to know that a reflex is an involuntary response to a stimulus. We need to know that nerve impulses can travel more than one route, and neuron pathways or reflex arcs, the route is an impulse flow. It's not a continuous. The simplest reflex arch consists of a sensory neuron synapsing in the spinal cord with a motor neuron. That's all that happens. Bip, bip. When we looked at the reflex for the knee, it says that it's the simplest form, that there's only 2 neurons reflecting it. A 3-neuron arch, it has to have an interneuron that synapses between the sensory neuron and the motor neuron. If all impulses, conduction ceases, life no longer exists. Okay, the neural pathway involved in the knee jerk reflex is the one on the neck on this page. Now, the interneuron is not involved in this one. If you have an interneuron involved, what happens is that the sensory neuron takes it to the interneuron, and then that interneuron turns around and sends it to the motor. So it's a longer response time. Here's another set of questions. I don't put these in all of my PowerPoints, and you probably won't see them in all the PowerPoints to come up next. I just wanted to really bring it home to you that these are there to help you. So, a nerve impulse is a self-procreating wave of electrical disturbance that travels along the surface of the neuron membrane and is called action potential. Okay, mechanism of a nerve impulse. At rest, the nerve is just slightly positive on the outside. It's polarized. It's got a slight excess of sodium on the outside. And as a stimulus triggers the opening of the sodium channels in the plasma membrane of the neuron. Now, do you remember seeing the picture of your sodium-potassium pump? Well, this is where you're going to see it utilized. Okay, let's start from the beginning. Okay, the impulse conduction normally starts with the receptors. Okay, so we said that the sensory neurons bring the information to the brain by means of receptors. There's an inward movement of sodium, that's where we're at right now, that depolarizes the membrane by making the inside more positive than the outside. At the stimulated point, this depolarization is the nerve impulse. So when that depolarizes, that's your action potential. The stimulated section of the membrane immediately depolarizes. But by that time, the depolarization has already triggered the next section of the membrane to depolarize, thus propagating the wave of electrical disturbance, depolarization, of all the way down the membrane. So, not every nerve is continuously racing. It does its thing, then the next one does its thing, then the next one does its thing. It just does it once and sends the message on. It's like when you turn on the switch to the light, the electricity's already went to that light. It's already told it to do it. It doesn't just keep telling it to do it. It just did open it up and it's done. Explain the mechanism of transmission of a nerve impulse along a nerve fiber and across a synapses. So, a synapses is where the information is the place where impulses are transmitted from one neuron to another, and the one that it's sending it to is the postsynaptic neuron. And the information that comes in would be from pressure, temperature, chemicals, changes in a usual stimulus for a nerve impulse. And when that information goes back out, it goes back out to the effector. Now, the effector is the organ that puts the nerve signal in effect, in parentheses, into effect, and are usually muscles or glands. So transmission of signals from one neuron to the next is an important part of the nerve conduction process. Okay, on the top of page 187, might want to write that number down, page 187, and go back and draw these and write these on the diagram. Okay, so the synaptic knob is what's on top of that picture, and that is your presynaptic. Now, what it is that's really an axon. And that axon is going to contain and release neurotransmitters. By the way, we'll talk about neurotransmitters in a little bit, okay? But it's the one that's going to send the message. It's going to send the message across a synaptic cleft, which is an area between the two, between the postsynaptic and the presynaptic areas. And that's where the chemicals are released to. And it's the space in there. And it's a plasma and a plasma membrane of the postsynaptic membrane. So it's between the two of them. So when you write on your paper, on your book, which, by the way, you own this book, write all over it. The synaptic axon is the one on the top, and that's an axon. The one on the bottom is postsynaptic which is your dendrite. So you might want to go back and look at your picture of what the nerve looks like. And you'll then see, oh, I can see how these would line up. Nerves aren't just one little entity. They work as a team. Now those neurotransmitters bind with specific receptor molecules in the membrane of the postsynaptic neuron, opening the ion channel and thereby stimulating impulse conduction by the membrane. So it's the little messengers that run across this little cleft is the neurotransmitters. We're going to look at a list of neurotransmitters. First on our list is acetylcholine. It's the transmitter that's present between the synapses in the spinal cord, okay, and the synapses that's the neuromuscular junction. So, neuromuscular, between the nerves and the muscles. Then there's the catecholamines. Now, the catecholamines, the role that they play is they help with sleep, motor function, mood, and pleasure recognition. Now, the next two on our list are endorphins and enkephalins, and they release a morphine-like transmitter. They help with pain, and they're natural painkillers. Then you have the nitric oxide, which is it diffuses directly across the plasma membrane of neurons rather than being released by vesicles. And then there's, of course, some more compounds, but we're only going to talk about those with these right here in this course. This is the picture that that I was referring to on page 187. Now I want to talk to you about some other way that the message is conducted, and that is saltatory conduction, and that's where the information jumps along the axon over the myelin sheath, and it jumps from one gap to the next gap, and it's a faster impulse. Number 5, identify the major anatomical components of the brain and the spinal cord and briefly comment on each function. So we're going to talk about each individual one's function. You can guarantee on the test you're going to need to know which are central nervous system and which are peripheral nervous system. I can guarantee that. So, central nervous system is anything that is central. It's the brain and the spinal cord. So that might help to think about it that way. So the brain is protected by the cranial cavity of the skull, and the spinal cord and the brain are protected by a membrane called the meninges. So we're going to go into more detail about those. We're going to start with the brainstem. And we're going to give you an overview of the brainstem. But what we're going to start with is this is the 3 names of the 3 parts of the brainstem. That brainstem gets damaged, you are dead. Period. That's what happened if you're a race car driver fan. That's what happened to Dale Earnhardt Sr. is that he had a brainstem injury. It makes you stop breathing. And your heart stop beating, and. And we're going to go into each one of these individually further in the slides. Let's say that you had an opportunity to look at a cadaver brain, and you're going to look at the brain stem. And when you look at that brain stem, it is going to be white matter with bits of gray matter scattered through it. So there's a whole lot of myelinated tissue here. What's its function? Well, the brainstem's function is to conduct sensory impulses to the higher parts of the brain. And then it's to send the impulses from the higher parts of the brain to the spinal column and then out to the periphery. Well, when you look at each one individually, I want to make sure that you think about the medulla oblongata. Now, the medulla oblongata is the lowest part of the brain. It's nearest the spinal cord, and it controls breathing and heart rate. It's the vital center. So it's where it controls cardiac rate, respiratory rate, basal muscle centers. The next part of the brain that we're going to talk about is the cerebellum. Now, the cerebellum is the second largest part of the brain. Its gray matter outer layer is thin, but it's highly folded, so it forms a larger surface, and the larger surface is needed to process information. It has arbor vitae, and what that is the tracts within the cerebellum, and they are tree-like in looking at them, and it's the white matter. And the cerebellum lives underneath the cerebral or cerebrum. Okay. Why do we have it there? What's it for? Well, the function is to control muscle contractions. So what does it do? It makes it so that we can stand up and have balance and move smoothly and have posture, straight up and down posture. Also, it assists the cerebrum and other organs of the brain. So it's an assisting area. The diencephalon is a small but very important part of the brain. So it contains the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the pineal gland. Each one of these contribute to the endocrine system. So the first one we're going to talk about is the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus consists mainly of the posterior pituitary gland and the pituitary stalk and some gray matter. And you're going to learn all sorts of fun stuff that pituitary gland does for us. Next one we'll mention is the hypothalamus. Well, the hypothalamus, hypo being down, lower, it is below the thalamus. It controls heartbeat and constriction and dilation of blood vessels, and contractions of the stomach and intestine, and also releases hormones such as antidiuretic hormone. It also helps to monitor temperature, sleep cycles, appetite, and emotions. The third part is the thalamus. The thalamus is drum-shaped, and it's a mass of gray matter extending toward each cerebral hemisphere. And its function is it helps to sense emotions. It plays a part in the arousal alert cycle. The pineal gland, or the pineal body, is a small body resembling a pine nut behind the thalamus. What's its function is to adjust time. So it's our time-keeping hormone. It's the one that gives out melatonin to help you sleep. It's responsible for processing the light-dark cycles, so the sunlight and moonlight cycles. This is a sagittal picture of the brain and the spinal column, spinal cord. Now, think about sagittal. What does that mean? Okay. This is where you can look at the different parts of the brain and see how they're all lined up in the center here, what we've been talking about. They're close to the spinal cord. And then down the bottom is a section of preserved brain. The cerebrum. Now, the cerebrum is the largest part of the human brain. It has 2 lobes. It has fissures. It's bent back upon itself. And all conscious thought, movement, thoughtfulness, thinking, and any voluntary movements are all controlled by the cerebrum. Now, the cerebrum has an outer lining that's called the cerebral cortex. And the cerebrum is mostly made up of dendrites and cell bodies of the neurons. The interior of the cerebrum is white matter, and it's mainly tracts, which is the nerve fibers arranged in bundles, and basal nuclei, which is the little islands of gray matter that regulate automatic movement. But the main function for the cerebrum is voluntary thought, movement. It's what makes us human. I just told you this on the previous slide. So here is the lobes of the cerebrum. The frontal lobe in the front. The parietal lobe is behind that one. The occipital lobe is the one that's just above that dent in your skull. If you put your fingers up your spine, it's the one just above your dent. And then the temporal is where your ear is, behind there. This is all the functional regions, a picture of all the functional regions of the cerebral cortex. I can guarantee you that some of this is going to be on your test. Like the medulla oblongata, the cerebellum, hypothalamus, thalamus, cerebrum. You need to know what these guys do. Because it'll help you to understand when there's damage done, what is my patient going to look like? So you don't need to know for now what happens, but you'll be studying neurological diseases and you need to know, oh, they have a damage here. Well, that's going to make this a difficulty. The other thing that I want to share with you is that strokes, which are CVAs, they can be either right-sided or left-sided. And we know that they're right-sided or left-sided because the right side affects the left side of the body and vice versa. Now, if you had a stroke on your right side, the right side of your face is going to have difficulties. Your right eye is going to have difficulties. But your left arm and left leg aren't going to work right. And it works the other way around because the nerves cross at the base of the skull. Now we're going to talk about the spinal cord. Spinal cord takes information from the brain down your spine, and it goes out nerves in between the vertebrae. So the spinal cord is a collection of nerves within that spinal cavity. It's a column of white matter with an interior of gray matter, and it's composed of bundles of myelinated fibers. So they form the upper portion. The outer portion looks sort of H-shaped, and the bundles of axons are called tracts, and the interior gray matter is mainly neuron dendrites and cell bodies. All right, the spinal cord. The spinal cord has two parts. There are ascending pathways and descending pathways. Well, if you were standing up, what would be the top? It would be your brain. So anything that's ascending is information from the sensory tracts to the brain. How about descending? If you were standing up, what comes below your brain? Anything that's descending. So that would be information that's going out to your periphery. The primary center for all spinal nerve reflexes is in the spinal cord. Now, if that spinal cord is severed, is cut, then you have paralysis of whatever is below that line. Now, remember Superman. He had a C2, I think C2, C3. And guess what? He can't breathe. There's no innervation to the diaphragm. So he has to be on a ventilator. And guess what? He's got problems with urination. And guess what? He has problems with bowel usage. He has problems using his arms and legs because it's way up there and that message can't get past where that's cut. Well, how am I going to know what's the name of the nerve? Well, it lines right up with the vertebrae. It comes out the side of the vertebrae. Like if it come out of C1, you've got a C1 injury if you have that vertebrae is severed. The spinal cord was severed there. That's what you have for damage. Okay, now, what is plexus? So a plexus is a network of intersecting or braided branches of a nerve fiber from several spinal nerves. They come together to form a single peripheral nerve. Look at the ones that are C5, C6, C7, C8. See how those all go together? That's your diaphragm, and it innervates your upper body. There are 3 layers of the spinal meninges, and it's sort of tube-like, and the outer layer is called the dura mater, and it lines the vertebral canal. Then you have the pia mater, and that is the innermost membrane covering the spinal cord itself. And then the arachnoid mater, which is the membrane between the dura mater and the pia mater. The arachnoid membrane resembles a cobweb with fluid in its spaces. Okay, this is a picture of the meninges and the spinal nerves and the sympathetic trunk. So this is a picture of what I was describing. Cerebral spinal fluid, that's what CSF is, and fluid spaces. So you have fluid spaces that are subarachnoid. You have a central canal inside the core. You have ventricles in the brain, which that's your small cavities in the brain. And that all has cerebral spinal fluid. We're going to talk about how it's formed and what's its purpose and what hydrocephalus is. Okay, so hydrocephalus is you got too much of the cerebral spinal fluid. Too much of it's formed. It's continually formed from the fluid that's filtered out of the blood into a network of brain capillaries known as the carotid plexus. And in the ventricles produced from fluid in the central nervous system. So to say that in less words, is it's fluid out of the blood. That's what it's made from. And it enters through the carotid plexus. So I would know that. Why do we have it there? Well, it helps the brain to float. It helps to prevent spinal injuries. It provides nutrients. It takes waste away. It's sort of a shock absorber to keep the delicate parts that it is holding in it, that it is holding from being hurt. Sort of a water cushion kind of thing. Next objective. Compare and contrast cranial and spinal nerves. When we're talking about cranial nerves and spinal nerves, we're talking about the peripheral nervous system. We are no longer talking about the central nervous system. We are away from the spine and the brain, So we are in the peripheral nervous system. There are 12 pairs of nerves that go to the face and shoulders. And those are called cranial nerves. They're attached under the surface of the brain. And you're going to need to know what their names are. They connect the brain with the neck and structures of the thorax and abdomen. That's what peripheral nerves do. All right, look at this. There is the 12 cranial nerves. There are two parts to knowing the 12 cranial nerves. One part is to know their name and where they're at. Really, 3 parts. Know their name, know where they affect, and know if they are sensory or motor. Or both, because some of them are both. So this drawing on the left-hand side, I find helpful. It doesn't help you remember the names of them, but it does help you to process where they are. So, 1 is your nose. How many noses do you have? You got 1. 2 is your eyes. Can't guess what you have 2 eyes. So that one I can always remember. And if I'm going up the head, 3 is my eyebrows. 4 has to do with downward and inward movement of the eyes. So if I'm looking at my nose, I'm doing 4. 5 is located the facial sensation of the maxillary, mandible, and mesentery strength and temporal muscles. So that's the whole face. It's got just all the muscles on the face. Number 6 is lateral movement of the eye. You wondered why they made you follow the stick, and yeah, they're checking your cranial nerves. And can't guess what? If you're drinking, it affects your cranial nerves, especially your eye movement. Your eye movement won't be smooth. It'll bounce, and that's what they're looking at. 7, I can puff up my cheeks. So my cheeks are in between my ears. See how the 7 goes from the top of the head down to the shoulders on either side? Well, that's the 7. 8 is your ears. 9 is your gag. 10 is your cough. 11 is shrugging your trapezius, and 10 is your tongue movement. So you're going to need to know those cranial nerves and what they do. If you're not a picture person, these are words. So things that you got to pay attention to is olfactory is your nose, optic is your eyes, then your vagus nerve, number 10. Number 10 is one that we become concerned about. If number 10 is stimulated, you can have uh, vagal stimulation, and it can affect your heartbeat, and it can slow it down. If you were a patient and you came in and you had what was called supraventricular tachycardia, your heart rate's 200, but there's no abnormal waves in it, just you've got a heart rate of 200. They want to slow your heart rate down. So they have you push by blowing in a bag. So that will slow down that heart. Now, what would happen if you were constipated and you held your breath and pushed down? Could you stop your heart? Most certainly. So there are more than one individual who has died what they thought was from vagal, it's called vagal stimulation. I heard rumors that Elvis might have been one. There's other ones that aren't coming to my head right now. So you don't want that vagus nerve stimulated. This is the most political correct, non-vulgar way that I could find to teach you the cranial nerves. Now, I know out there's some really bad ones, but I'm not going to teach those to you. If you want to use really bad ones, you use them on your own, okay? I'm not against it, but I'm not going to teach them to you. So, to take a family vacation, go Vegas after hour. So, you got olfactory, optical, oculomotor, trochlear, trigeminal, abductus, facial, vestibular, ocular, the glossopharyngeal, the vagus, the accessory, and the hypoglossal. So that is a way to help remember the names of them. Then to remember if they are sensory, motor, or both. So you've got sensory, motor, both, sensory, both, motor. Okay, so a little rhyme for that is, so some say marry money, but my brother says big business makes money. There's a real disgusting one for that one too, but I'm not going there. You'll have to find your own bad ones. But these are nice, easy ones to memorize. Or you can memorize them with the number. 1 is the, 2 is the, 3 is the. It'll work. I'm more into trucks, so I would use this one because I like trusty trucks. Peripheral nervous system. Well, in the peripheral nervous system, you have 31 pairs of nerves. They contain dendrites and sensory neurons and axons for motor neurons. They conduct impulses necessary for sensation and voluntary movement. Sidebar, dermatome is a skin surface area supplied by a single spinal nerve. Other structures that we need to worry about are there's various glands of the body that are connected to the peripheral nervous system, and those are related to the heart and the thorax, and then how the spinal nerves are named. If it comes out of C1, vertebrae C1, it's called the first cervical vertebrae. If it comes out of T8, it's called the 8th thoracic vertebrae. Now, if we were saying about C1, some of the things you need to remember about C1 is C1 is the most common for shingles. It's also the plexus. Remember me telling you there was a bunch that hooked together and it was called the plexus? Well, this is where the plexus goes out, it's a C1. And if you were to have shingles, it would be the very end of those nerve endings. Discuss the anatomical and functional characteristics of the two divisions of the autonomic nervous system. Autonomic, it's automatic, the automatic nervous system. But you need to remember it as autonomic, not automatic. The autonomic nervous system consists of motor neurons that conduct impulses from the central nervous system to the heart, the smooth muscle, the glandular epithelial tissue, regulates body automatically, and it does involuntary functions. Okay, so you need to know that there's an opposite here. You know how we are set up to have homeostasis. So if there's something that makes you go right, there's something that makes you go left. Well, the opposite of the somatic nervous system is, opposite of the autonomic nervous system is the somatic nervous system. And that the somatic nervous system, it controls the voluntary skeletal muscle. So let's keep this straight. Autonomic nervous system, automatic. Somatic nervous system is voluntary. So if I was to ask you what the somatic nervous system did, you should be able to tell me. Okay, preganglionic autonomic neurons. They conduct impulses from the spinal cord or the brain stem to the autonomic ganglia. The postganglionic neurons conduct the autonomic ganglia to the heart muscle, smooth muscle, and glandular tissues, glandular epithelial tissues. All right, the autonomic nervous system is divided into two categories. There's two divisions of it. So we're talking about the autonomic nervous system, not the somatic, the autonomic. It's divided into two divisions, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic system. Now, know that these systems have two names. The sympathetic system is also the thoracolumbar one, and the parasympathetic system is the cranial sacral. And you'll need to know that, and know that they match up. If you look at this down and dirty, okay, the sympathetic stimulates. The sympathetic steps on the gas. The sympathetic is what happens when you see a snake or a spider or somebody jumps out of you at night. That's what kicks in. So think of what happens to you when that happens. Like your heart beats faster. We'll go through that list here in a minute. The parasympathetic nervous system puts on the brakes. When the parasympathetic system is working, you are resting and you are digesting. So you're resting and your food is processing. So let's break it down so that you have a nice list of what's going to happen in each of these. So the parasympathetic nervous system, what you'll see is it controls the organs under normal everyday conditions. It increases the secretion of digestive juices. It slows the heart rate. It constricts the pupils. All of them being whoosh, I'm relaxed. Okay? The sympathetic nervous system, on the other hand, steps on the gas. So what are you going to find? Well, the post-ganglion neurons release norepinephrine, which increases sweat production, which stimulates goosebumps, which gives you your fight or flight response, which also causes vasoconstriction of the blood vessels in the skin, increased heart rate, but they all go back to sympathetic. We're stepping on the gas because we're doing fight or flight. The parasympathetic, you're putting on the brakes because you're going to rest and digest. Okay, the sympathetic pathways are highlighted in orange, and the parasympathetic pathways are highlighted in green. Branches of the preganglic axon may ascend or descend to terminate in the ganglia above and below their point of origin. Together, all of these varied sympathetic responses make us ready for strenuous muscle work. We need such physiological preparation when facing a threat. Parasympathetic preganglion neurons, they have dendrites and cell bodies in the gray matter of the brainstem and the sacral sections of the spinal cord. They terminate in parasympathetic ganglia located in the head and the thoracic and abdominal cavities close to visceral effectors. Each parasympathetic preganglion neuron synapses with postganglion neurons to only one effector. Okay, what did we say about the parasympathetic division? What was its function? Put on the brakes, right? It demonstrates control of many visceral effectors and under normal everyday conditions. It counterbalances sympathetic function. Autonomic neurotransmitters. You're going to recognize these names because we've already said they're neurotransmitters. We're just telling you that they happen in the autonomic nervous system and what they do there. So the cholinergic fibers are your preganglionic axons of the parasympathetic and the sympathetic system, and the parasympathetic postganglion axons release acetylcholine. The adrenergic fibers, which are the axons of sympathetic postganglionic neurons, release norepinephrine. So it's sympathetic. So what's going to happen? What do you think that norepinephrine is going to do? It's going to speed things up because it is sympathetic. Okay, autonomic nervous system. We told you that that makes the body automatic, and it maintains homeostasis, and it has many visceral effectors and are doubly innervated. That is, they receive fibers from both the parasympathetic and the sympathetic divisions and are influenced in opposite ways by the two divisions. I want you to take a look in the PowerPoint and see what is afferent and what is efferent. So when you go back, take a look and see if you can find what that is.